You have been taught your entire life that realism is a virtue, that seeing things clearly, staying grounded, keeping your expectations reasonable, is the mark of a mature mind. Nobody ever tells you the truth about where that belief leads. It leads to a small life, a life sized exactly to what other people already believe is possible for someone like you. Because here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Every person who has ever built real power looked, from the outside, completely delusional before they built it. We are not talking about ignoring reality today. We are talking about refusing to be governed by it before you have finished shaping it. Machiavelli never wrote a word about staying realistic. He wrote about virtu, the will to bend fortune itself toward your intentions, even when the odds in front of you say it cannot be done. So ask yourself the question almost nobody survives asking honestly. If you stripped away every reasonable expectation you have quietly accepted about your own life, what would you actually attempt? Most people go silent right there. That silence is the cage. It was built for you by people who needed you predictable, and you have been living inside it, calling it good sense. There is a difference between denial and delusion used as a weapon. Denial refuses to see the field. Weaponized delusion sees the field perfectly and refuses to accept its current shape as final. In the next few minutes, you are going to see exactly how Machiavelli built that weapon, how it separates the men who move history from the men who explain why it can't be done, and how you install it in yourself without losing your mind in the process. By the end of this video, the cage that has been quietly sizing your entire life is going to look a great deal smaller than it does right now. Lesson 1. The prison built from accurate information. Every piece of advice you have ever received about being realistic came from someone measuring your future using data from your past. Your grades, your family, your industry, your current bank account, all fed into a quiet calculation that produced a range of acceptable outcomes for someone exactly like you. This is not malicious. It is simply how most minds operate. They extrapolate. They take what has been true and assume it will keep being true, and they call that assumption wisdom. Machiavelli understood something most advisors of his time refused to say directly. Fortune, the unpredictable force that decides half of what happens to any man, only rewards the ones willing to act as though they already have leverage over it. He did not tell princes to accept the odds. He told them to behave as though the odds were negotiable, because behavior shapes outcome long before outcome confirms belief. Think about how much of your own hesitation has nothing to do with your actual capability and everything to do with a mental model built from what people around you consider normal. That model was never designed to help you exceed anything. It was designed to keep an entire group predictable and manageable, because unpredictable people are harder to lead and harder to control. You were handed a ceiling and told it was the sky. In the next section, we go deeper into exactly how Machiavelli engineered belief on purpose, and why the prince who acts first and calculates second consistently outperforms the one who waits for permission from the odds, and why that ceiling you've been living under was never load-bearing in the first place. Lesson 2. Virtue and the manufactured advantage. Machiavelli spent the prince circling one central idea from every possible angle. Fortune controls roughly half of what happens to a man. The other half belongs entirely to virtu, a fierce, self-generated will that refuses to wait for permission from circumstance. This is not confidence in the soft, modern sense. It is a manufactured advantage, built deliberately, aimed directly at bending outcomes that look fixed to everyone else watching. Here is what almost nobody tells you about virtue. It has to exist before the evidence does. You cannot wait until you have proof you are capable of something extraordinary, because the proof only appears after you have already acted as though the extraordinary version of you was real the entire time. This is the exact mechanism behind what looks from the outside like delusion. It is belief installed ahead of confirmation, on purpose, as a strategic decision rather than an accident of personality. Most people treat confidence as a reward for competence. Machiavelli treated it as raw material you generate first, because the actions that competence requires will not happen without it. That is not magic. That is a predictable feature of how groups negotiate authority in real time. So the question becomes practical rather than philosophical. How do you manufacture virtue before you have earned it through results? You start by refusing to let your internal language match your current limitations. You stop narrating your life using the cautious vocabulary everyone around you has agreed on, and you start speaking to yourself using the vocabulary of someone who has already crossed the gap you're standing in front of. This feels dishonest the first few times you try it. It is not dishonest. It is training, the same way rehearsal is not lying about a performance that hasn't happened yet. And once the vocabulary changes, the actions built on top of it start changing whether you consciously push them to or not. Lesson 3. The self-fulfilling architecture of belief. There is a mechanical reason weaponized delusion actually works, and it has nothing to do with wishful thinking. Belief changes behavior before it changes outcome, and behavior is the only variable a person actually controls in any given situation. When you believe an outcome belongs to you, you show up earlier, you ask more directly, you tolerate more discomfort on the way there, and you interpret setbacks as information instead of verdicts. None of that requires the outcome to be guaranteed. It only requires you to act as though it matters enough to survive contact with difficulty. This is where most people quietly sabotage themselves without ever noticing the mechanism. They treat a single rejection or a single failed attempt as proof their original belief was naive, and they retreat back into the reasonable range of expectation they were trying to escape. Machiavelli watched princes fail this exact way constantly. The ones who folded at the first resistance were never remembered as cautious and wise. They were remembered as men who never had a real chance because they never behaved like men who did. Here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Reality is far more negotiable in the short term than most people are willing to admit, especially in anything involving other human beings making decisions about you. Perception shapes opportunity constantly. The person who is perceived as inevitable gets handed opportunities the merely competent person never sees, not because the world is unfair, but because certainty is magnetic and hesitation is not. This does not mean perception replaces substance. It means perception opens the door that substance then has to walk through and prove itself inside, and without the door, even real substance sits outside, unseen, unrewarded, and eventually mistaken for something less than it is. Without the manufactured belief, the door frequently never opens at all, because nobody hands real opportunity to someone who looks unsure they even want it. Consider your own history for a moment. The moments where things moved fastest in your favor were almost certainly moments where you had already decided internally that the outcome belonged to you before anyone else confirmed it. And the moments where you stayed stuck were almost certainly moments where you were still waiting for permission that was never going to arrive from outside. This is the self-fulfilling architecture Machiavelli understood centuries before modern psychology gave it clinical names. Belief is not separate from strategy. Belief is the first move in the strategy, executed before the board even looks winnable to anyone watching from the outside, which raises an uncomfortable question about how much of your own stuckness has actually just been a belief you never got around to moving first. Lesson 4. The discipline that keeps delusion from becoming ruin. This is the part that separates a prince from a fool, and Machiavelli was ruthlessly clear about the difference even though modern retellings tend to flatten it. Weaponized belief without discipline is not virtue. It is simply arrogance wearing virtue's costume, and arrogance gets men killed in ways confidence never does. The delusion that builds power has to be paired with an almost obsessive attention to the actual terrain in front of you, because refusing to accept the odds as final is not the same as refusing to see them clearly. You have to know exactly what you are up against to bend it. You cannot bend what you have never bothered to study. This is where most people who try to adopt this mindset get it catastrophically wrong. They here refuse to be reasonable, and they interpret it as an excuse to ignore feedback, dismiss criticism, and treat every setback as someone else's failure to recognize their greatness. That is not manufactured virtue. That is a fragile ego mistaking noise for conviction. The Prince Machiavelli studied his enemies obsessively, tracked every shift in loyalty and circumstance with cold precision, and still refused to let the current balance of power dictate what he believed was ultimately possible for himself. Those two things are not contradictions. They are the entire discipline. See the field with total clarity. Refuse to accept the field's current shape as permanent. Held together, that combination produces movement. Held apart, either half collapses into something useless. Clarity without belief produces paralysis. A man who understands the odds so completely he never risks anything against them. Belief without clarity produces a man who charges into walls he never bothered to measure and calls the resulting damage bad luck. Only that exact combination produces a prince rather than a corpse or a coward. The actual discipline is uncomfortable because it demands you hold two things at once that feel like they should cancel each other out. You have to absorb hard, unflattering feedback about your current position without letting that feedback rewrite your belief about your eventual position. Most people cannot separate those two things. A single piece of criticism collapses their entire sense of what is possible for them because their belief was never actually independent of outside confirmation in the first place. Manufactured virtue is independent by design. It takes the criticism, extracts whatever is useful from it, and discards the part that was trying to shrink you back down to a manageable size, which is the exact discipline that keeps a prince instead of turning him into a cautionary tale. Lesson 5. The return to the field with the cage removed. Everything covered so far builds toward one practical question. What does this actually look like once you stop reading about it and start living inside it? The prince did not spend his days meditating on belief in isolation. He returned to the field, to negotiations, to conflict, to the exact terrain that had originally produced the reasonable expectations he refused to accept, and he moved through it differently because the internal architecture behind his decisions had already changed. This is the part that matters most, because belief that never gets tested against real terrain is just a private fantasy, comfortable and completely useless. The manufactured advantage only becomes real power once you carry it back into the room where the original limitations were handed to you and you behave deliberately as though those limitations no longer apply. This will feel disorienting the first several times. People who knew the old version of you, the reasonable version, the appropriately expectant version, will notice the shift before you fully trust it yourself. Some of them will respond to your new certainty by testing it, pushing against it to see if it collapses under pressure the way arrogance usually does. This is exactly where the discipline from the previous lesson earns its keep. You absorb the pressure, you adjust the specific tactic where the feedback is genuinely useful, and you do not let the pressure talk you back down into the cage you just spent this entire process dismantling. Over time, something practical happens that has nothing to do with mysticism. People around you begin recalibrating their own expectations of you, quietly and mostly without announcing it, because human beings constantly update their models of each other based on demonstrated behavior. The version of you who asks directly, who does not apologize for wanting more, who treats setbacks as information rather than verdicts, produces a different pattern of outcomes over months and years than the version of you who stayed inside the range everyone originally agreed was reasonable. This is not a single dramatic transformation completed in one sitting. It is a repeated posture, chosen again in every room, every negotiation, every moment where the old cautious voice tries to reassert its version of realistic. Machiavelli never promised comfort in exchange for this posture. He promised outcomes that comfort was never going to produce on its own. The cage was accurate. That was never the problem. The problem was mistaking accurate for permanent, and carrying that mistake back into every room you've walked into since. Every idea in this video comes down to one uncomfortable fact most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The realistic version of your future was calculated using information that was never designed to account for who you're capable of becoming once you stop confirming it. Machiavelli built an entire philosophy of power around refusing to let accurate information dictate final outcomes, and that refusal was never reckless. It was disciplined, deliberate, and paired with a clarity most people never bother developing because clarity is uncomfortable and belief feels safer without it. You started this video with a set of expectations someone else handed you quietly over years using nothing but perfectly accurate data about your past. If you followed this honestly, even just in your own mind while listening, you already understand that accurate data about your past was never a verdict on your future. It was only ever a starting position. Refuse to be reasonable where reasonable has only ever meant small. See the field with total clarity. Manufacture belief before the evidence arrives to justify it. Return to the terrain that built your original cage and move through it differently, again and again, until the people around you stop expecting the old version of you to show back up. This channel exists to keep handing you the exact mechanics behind this kind of power, past the surface-level advice that changes nothing real, and deeper than the version of this idea you have already heard 100 watered-down times without ever being told how to actually install it. If today's video moved something in you, do 3 things right now. Like this video so more people trapped inside someone else's reasonable expectations get a real chance to find it. Share it with someone you know who has been talking themselves out of something for years. Subscribe right now, because the next video goes even further into exactly how princes built the belief that outlasted them. Before you go, drop this final line in the comments one more time so it stays with you. I refuse to be reasonable. I see clearly and I still refuse to shrink. I return with the cage already gone. This was never entertainment to consume once and forget. It was a door. Come back to it whenever reasonable starts feeling permanent again. I will see you in the next one.